There is a sentence that Canada has now said so many times to so many American officials in so many different rooms that it has essentially become a wall. 4 words, that is all. No threats, no dramatic walkouts, no emergency press conferences, no raised voices. Just 4 words stated calmly, stated repeatedly, stated with the kind of quiet certainty that is more unsettling to Washington than any amount of anger could ever be. And those 4 words are now sitting at the absolute center of the most important trade negotiation in North American history. Here is what is actually happening and why it matters far more than most people realize. Washington wants Canada's dairy market. It has wanted it for years, decades in fact. American dairy farmers, American trade officials, American senators. They have been pushing for greater access to Canada's tightly controlled milk, butter, and cheese supply since before most people currently paying attention to this trade war were born. And every single time they push, Canada says the same thing. Not on the table. To understand why this fight has become so explosive and why Canada's refusal to move on it could decide the fate of a deal worth $1.93 trillion in annual trade, you need to understand what Canada's supply management system actually is. Because most people outside Canada have never heard of it. And most people inside Canada take it so completely for granted that they have never stopped to think about why it exists or how it was built or what it would mean to lose it. The story starts in the 1960s. At that time, Canadian dairy farmers were in serious trouble. Prices were volatile, processors had all the power. They knew that if farmers tried to hold out for a better price, the milk would spoil and be worth nothing. So farmers were paid whatever processors decided to pay them. In good years, they managed. In bad years, they did not. And the volatility was constant. Too much milk in the market, prices crashed, not enough supply, shortages. Farmers in Ontario and Quebec, who together produced the majority of Canada's dairy, had essentially no bargaining power at all. Across the border in the United States, the government was dealing with the same problem through a different method. Washington was paying direct subsidies to dairy farmers to keep them afloat. The American taxpayer was effectively propping up the American dairy industry. The US system produced a lot of cheap milk, but it also produced mountains of surplus that the government had to buy and store and sometimes destroy. Canada looked at that system and decided to build something different. In 1969, Ontario and Quebec implemented supply management for dairy. Other provinces followed. In 1972, the federal government passed the Farm Products Agencies Act, which created national marketing boards for eggs and poultry as well. And by the late 1970s and early 1980s, all 10 provinces had joined the system. Here is how it works. The system rests on 3 pillars. Production discipline, where farmers agree to produce only as much as the market needs, controlled through quotas. Cost of production pricing, where farmers receive a price that covers their actual costs, plus a fair margin. And import controls, with steep tariffs on foreign products above quota thresholds that prevent foreign competitors from undercutting Canadian prices. The numbers on those tariffs are the ones that make American politicians furious. If you want to import butter into Canada above the quota threshold, you face a tariff of 298%. Fluid milk over the quota carries a 241% tariff. These are not rounding errors. These are walls, intentional, deliberate, legally constructed walls designed specifically to make it economically impossible for foreign dairy to flood the Canadian market. The result is a food system that looks completely different from the American one. Today, Canada's supply-managed sectors, dairy, eggs, and poultry combined, support nearly 431,000 full-time jobs across the country and contribute $45.1 billion to Canada's GDP. Dairy alone sustains 270,000 jobs and accounts for $28 billion in economic output. These are not small numbers. These are the backbone of rural economies in Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia and across the prairies. And critically, the system works without government subsidies. Canadian dairy farmers do not receive direct government payments to stay in business. The system is self-sustaining, which means Canadian taxpayers are not paying to prop up dairy farmers the way American taxpayers are. Canadian grocery prices for dairy are higher than American prices, but Canadian farmers are financially stable and the supply is reliable. When H5N1 avian flu devastated American egg farms between 2022 and 2025, culling more than 168 million birds in the United States and driving American egg prices to historic highs, so high that some people were decorating potatoes at Easter because eggs had become unaffordable, Canada's supply-managed egg system absorbed the shock far more effectively. In Canada, roughly 1.2% of hens were culled. In the United States, the figure was 16%. Canadian egg prices remained comparatively stable. In Toronto and Vancouver and Halifax, you could still find a dozen free-run eggs on sale for $5. That comparison, American egg prices collapsing in stability while Canadian eggs remained relatively predictable, is not an accident. It is exactly what supply management was built to do. Now, here is where Washington comes in and why the current trade war has made a decades-long argument suddenly feel like a crisis. The United States has been complaining about Canada's supply management system since before NAFTA was signed in 1994. Every trade negotiation, every bilateral conversation, every agricultural summit, American dairy interests have been at the table demanding greater access to Canada's market. In the original NAFTA negotiations, Canada kept supply management protected. In the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement of 1989, dairy and poultry were essentially kept off the table. When USMCA was negotiated in 2018 during Trump's first term, the US finally extracted a concession. Canada agreed to open 3.5% of its dairy market to American products. American trade officials called it a victory. Canadian farmers called it a painful compromise, and Canadian negotiators made absolutely clear at the time that this was the ceiling. No further concessions. 3.5% was the limit. The U.S. dairy industry took the 3.5% and immediately started pushing for more. In 2021, the U.S. took Canada to a USMCA dispute settlement panel, arguing Canada was not honoring the market access commitment it had made in 2018. The panel ruled in favor of the U.S. and Canada revised some of its quota allocation practices. Then in 2023, the U.S. brought a similar complaint again. That panel ruled in Canada's favor. Washington's reaction was to view the panel process itself as insufficient and to push for structural changes to be part of the USMCA review process. And then Donald Trump came back to the White House. From the very first weeks of Trump's second term, the administration signaled that USMCA renewal would not be a rubber stamp. It would be a renegotiation. And dairy, along with supply management broadly, would be at the top of the American demand list. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told Congress directly that the shortcomings of the current agreement are such that a rubber stamp renewal is not in the national interest. He listed dairy market access as one of the key structural issues that would need to be resolved before the U.S. would agree to extend the deal for another 16 years. Canada's response was delivered by Mark Carney himself. In January 2026, speaking to reporters in Montreal after his first phone call with Trump since becoming Prime Minister, Carney was asked about supply management. His answer took approximately 5 seconds. "We will never have discussions with respect to supply management. It is off the table, not we are reluctant to discuss it. Not we would require significant concessions in return. Not it is a complicated issue requiring careful consideration. Never. Off the table." He answered the follow-up question in French. That was intentional. Quebec has more dairy farms than any other province. In Quebec, supply management is not an agricultural policy. It is a cultural and political identity. Every major party in Quebec politics, left and right and center, defends supply management as an article of faith. When a Canadian Prime Minister answers a question about dairy in French while standing in Montreal, he is not just making a policy statement. He is making a declaration of political solidarity with 4 million people who will not forgive any leader who trades their farms away. Then in December 2025, when Greer publicly doubled down on the dairy demand at a congressional hearing, Carney said it again: supply management is not on the table. Same words, same calm delivery, same absolute certainty. Then Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, said it again in October 2025, standing alongside the Agriculture Minister in Ottawa. "We have been very clear from the beginning that supply management is not a subject of negotiations with the Americans." He said it after a Globe and Mail report suggested there might be room for compromise. He said it to shut that suggestion down completely. Then LeBlanc said it again at the Globe and Mail's Intersect conference in late April 2026, in what he himself described as his most candid comments to date about the state of the trade talks. "We are not going to limit, reduce, or negotiate those language requirements, the cultural exemption. We are not going to reopen supply management and have a discussion around quotas in the supply managed sector." And then Canada went further than words. Parliament passed a law, Bill C-202. It received royal assent on June 26, 2025. The legislation explicitly prohibits Canada from including supply-managed goods in future trade deals. This is not a ministerial directive. It is not a cabinet policy. It is not even a party platform commitment. It is a statute, a law passed by the elected Parliament of Canada that makes it legally impossible for any Canadian government negotiator, under any amount of external pressure, to offer supply management as a bargaining chip. LeBlanc explained it without any ambiguity. Parliament passed a law that we supported happily to make it clear that supply management is not a subject of negotiation in international trade agreements. The spokesperson for Canada-US Trade Minister LeBlanc issued a formal statement on the subject. "Our supply management system will never be on the table. When a government passes a law specifically designed to prevent future governments from making a concession, it is sending a message that goes beyond politics. It is saying to Washington, this is not about who is in power in Ottawa. This is not about whether the liberals or the conservatives or anyone else wins the next election. This has been written into the legal architecture of the country. You cannot negotiate it away because it is against the law to try. Now, here is where the July 1st deadline collides with all of this in ways that are genuinely alarming for the entire North American economy. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the deal that governs $1.93 trillion in annual trade between the three countries and supports 56.2 million jobs across North America, has a built-in review clause. By July 1st, 2026, all three parties must agree whether to extend the agreement for another 16 years or let it enter a period of annual reviews for up to 10 years, after which it would expire. That deadline is now weeks away, and Washington and Ottawa are, in the words of one analysis published just 3 days ago, nowhere near agreement. The gap between what the US wants and what Canada will offer is described as enormous. Here is the dynamic that is currently paralyzing the process. U.S. negotiators have told their Canadian counterparts that before formal USMCA talks can begin in earnest, before the two sides even sit down at the table to negotiate a renewal, Canada must first pay what Canadian media has taken to calling an entry fee. Change domestic policies as a precondition for negotiations. Open dairy, remove provincial alcohol bans, modify digital media legislation. Pay the entry fee first, then we will talk. Canada's answer came from Carney directly on April 23, 2026. He rejected the entire concept. He said Canada will not accept the premise that Washington sets conditions before talks begin. He noted that in 2025, Canada had already removed its digital services tax, a major concession that American tech companies had been demanding for years. Canada had also removed retaliatory tariffs on billions of dollars of American goods. Canada gave ground, and Washington responded by maintaining steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, and automobile tariffs. Canada made concessions and received nothing in return. When asked directly about Jamieson Greer, Trump's top trade official and the man leading the American side of these negotiations, Carney was asked in French by reporters after a Liberal caucus meeting what negotiating experience Greer actually brings. Carney's answer was a single question back. What has he ever negotiated? That is a sitting Prime Minister of Canada publicly questioning the qualifications of the man leading the United States trade strategy. One Canadian government source speaking to the Globe and Mail on condition of anonymity provided the sharpest assessment of what Washington is actually doing. The source said the U.S. appears content with the current situation. Washington is collecting billions in tariff revenue from Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles. It has no urgent financial incentive to reach a deal. Its strategy, the source said, is to keep extracting concessions from Canada while the clock on the July 1st deadline runs down. And Canada's response to that strategy is to refuse to be extracted from. Hold the line on supply management. Hold the line on the red lines. Wait out the clock rather than give away the farm, literally, under deadline pressure. Trade Minister LeBlanc said it plainly. He does not expect negotiations to be wrapped up by July 1st. This was not alarm. This was a statement of strategic positioning. July 1st is the date prescribed in the treaty, but there is nothing stopping the three countries from agreeing at some subsequent date to extend the agreement another 16 years. LeBlanc said his team is prepared to work through the summer. The deadline is not a cliff. It is a starting gun. The Wall Street firm Jefferies, which analyzed the USMCA situation in detail, put the odds of a clean 16-year renewal by July 1st at just 10%. Their base case, the most likely outcome, is a 75% probability that the agreement enters annual reviews. A prolonged state of uncertainty that in their language lowers conviction of businesses and investors for years to come. The Center for Strategic and International Studies laid out the scenarios. Painful extension where negotiations drag past July 1st and limited concessions keep talks alive, but businesses operate in uncertainty. Annual reviews where no deal is reached by July 1st and USMCA stays technically in force but under a permanent cloud. And bilateral fallback, the most disruptive scenario where the trilateral arrangement collapses and the U.S. tries to negotiate separately with Canada and Mexico. Each scenario carries economic consequences for ordinary people that have nothing to do with dairy. The automobile industry, where a single car crossing the U.S.-Canada border can have parts that crossed 8 times during manufacturing, faces disruption if USMCA enters uncertainty. Foreign automakers have already warned the Trump administration they could pull their most affordable models from the U.S. market if the agreement is not renewed. American housing costs, which are already at historic highs in part because of tariffs on Canadian lumber, would be pushed higher still. Energy bills, grocery prices, jobs, 56.2 million of them tied to North American trade. Canada's supply-managed sectors, the dairy farms in Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia, the egg operations, the poultry producers, support 431,000 of those jobs directly. If supply management were dismantled or even significantly weakened, the analysis commissioned in 2015 by AgriPur, one of Canada's largest dairy cooperatives, projected that 24,000 jobs would be at immediate risk in Canada, 50% of Quebec dairy farms could close, and Canada's GDP would fall by $3.5 billion. Those are Canadian losses. But there is a side of this that American dairy interests have consistently failed to calculate. Canada's supply management system exists precisely because the alternative, a free market dairy system like America's, produces exactly the kind of chaos that American dairy farmers are currently living through. The United States dairy industry is so overproductive that it requires constant government support payments to keep farmers in business. American dairy exports flood global markets, suppressing prices worldwide. And when H5N1 devastates American flocks and egg prices spike to unaffordable levels, American consumers have no buffer. There is no system designed to absorb the shock. There are just empty shelves and people decorating potatoes at Easter. Canada built its system specifically so that would never happen here. And now Washington is demanding Canada dismantle it as the price of a trade deal. Canada's answer has not changed, will not change, and cannot change because Parliament made it the law. This is the trade standoff that nobody is covering properly. It is not about wheat quotas or tariff percentages or technical USMCA provisions. It is about a fundamental clash between two completely different philosophies of how a food system should work. America believes open markets produce the best outcomes for everyone eventually, even if the short-term pain is severe. Canada built an institution specifically designed to protect against that short-term pain and has been defending it through every trade negotiation, through QSFTA, through NAFTA, through USMCA, and now through this, for over 50 years. And now the most important trade deal deadline in modern North American history is arriving. On one side of the table, Washington is demanding structural changes to a system Canada has protected through every negotiation for half a century. On the other side, Canada has a prime minister who says never, a trade minister who says off the table, and a parliament that passed a law. 4 words said in Montreal and Ottawa and Toronto and at conferences and in parliamentary committees and to reporters in French and in English for months and months and months. Not on the table. Washington can demand dairy in every meeting. Greer can tell Congress it is non-negotiable from the American side. Senators can write letters. American dairy farmers can lobby. American trade lawyers can build arguments. Analysts can model what Canadian concessions would mean for U.S. farm revenue. Canada has one answer to all of it. It passed a law. And when July 1st arrives and the most important trade deadline in North American history comes due, that law will still be in place. The wall will still be standing. And those 4 words will still mean exactly what they have always meant. Not on the table. Not today. Not under deadline pressure, not in exchange for tariff relief, not for any deal Washington is currently prepared to offer.